The SR-71 was a groundbreaking aircraft designed to take the place of the U-2 spy plane. But in the time between the U-2 and before the SR-71, another aircraft was proposed and designed by the same man, Clarence Kelly Jonhson. This would be so radical that it had the classification of above top secret, and its existence would only become known some 15 years later in 1973, and even now few know about it. Though it never came to fruition, the work done would go on to influence not only the SR-71 itself, but also the space industry, Apollo and the Space Shuttle. This is the story of Project Suntan and the CL-400. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. After World War II, relations between the Soviet Union and the West deteriorated rapidly. In 1949, and to everyone's surprise, the Soviets exploded their own atomic bomb, and the closed Soviet state became a very real threat. So there was an urgent need for the US to know just what they were up to. The Soviets defended their borders and airspace aggressively, attacking anything that came close, and the existing US reconnaissance aircraft, which were just converted World War II bombers, made an easy target for the Soviet air defences. The US needed an aircraft that could fly over otherwise out-of-reach areas to take reconnaissance photos, but one that could also avoid the MiG-17 fighters and surface-to-air missiles. That aircraft would be the U-2 spy plane. It could fly at 70,000 feet or 21,300 metres out of the range of the Soviets, and although it was operated by the USAF, it was controlled by the CIA. Now, whilst things seemed to be going well, the USAF resented the fact that they were subservient to the CIA and were looking not only to take over the U-2 operations, they also wanted to develop their own successor that would outperform the U-2. Meanwhile, Clarence Kelly Jonhson, the designer of the Lockheed U-2, was concerned at the very high altitudes of 70,000 feet where the aircraft operated. He believed that there was a very real possibility of the engines flaming out, as they were at the operational limits of the specially formulated JPTS jet fuel. If this happened, the U-2 would have to descend to around 9,000 metres or 30,000 feet to relight its engines, and at this height, it would be a sitting duck. Losing a U-2 in Soviet airspace would have huge political ramifications, something that would be borne out in 1960 when Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane was downed by a surface-to-air missile over the Soviet Union. By 1955, the USAF was conducting a number of R&D projects looking at using hydrogen to power both existing turbojet engines and new hydrogen-optimized engines. Data from the tests showed that a hydrogen-powered engine could operate at altitudes of up to 100,000 feet or 30,500 meters, some 30,000 feet higher than the U-2. Meanwhile, Lockheed's Skunk Works had finished building the U-2 prototypes and was already working on the study of hydrogen-fueled aircraft for the Garrett Corporation that had bought the rights to a hydrogen-powered engine called the Rex 3. Jonhson, the chief designer for the Skunk Works, saw an opportunity to take forward the work they had done with the U-2 and combine it with the hydrogen-powered engines to achieve something new and make a supersonic aircraft that would fly at 100,000 feet. The Air Force, who had missed out on the U-2, jumped at the chance to have one up on the CIA and wanted the new plane within 2 to 3 years, whilst glossing over the considerable difficulties that working with hydrogen still presented. Because the U-2 was classified and the Air Force's new plane would be superior, it was given the classification of above top secret, and Project Suntan was born. Within weeks of a contract to build 2 prototypes and 6 further aircraft, Lockheed gave the aircraft the designation of CL-400, and Pratt and Whitney were contracted to build the engines which would be known as the 304-2, a hydrogen-optimized turbojet engine based on a simplified version of the Rex 3. The CL-400 would have a top speed of Mach 2.5 and an altitude ceiling of 30,300 metres or 99,409 feet. It would have a fuselage diameter of 3 metres and be 49 metres long with engines mounted on the ends of the wings, and in some ways it would look like an oversized Lockheed F-104 starfighter. Although hydrogen has 3 times the amount of energy per kilogram compared to kerosene-based jet fuels, because of its low density it takes up 4 times the volume. This had to be stored in cryogenic tanks at -250°C in the fuselage because the wings would have got too hot at the supersonic speeds to place the tanks into. A typical mission profile would need a range of 4,070 kilometers, meaning that the target would have to be within 2,000 kilometers of the takeoff and landing bases. The only way to increase the range would be to dramatically increase the size of the aircraft itself to hold more hydrogen. This raised another issue in the availability of hydrogen and transporting it around the world to bases where the plane would operate from. If this was to be successful, then it would have to be produced in quantity and shipped and handled like gasoline. And just getting enough to test the engines and the pumps posed a problem. Initially it was produced in an old bomb shelter at the Skunk Works, which was named Fort Robertson after the man who ran the operation. However, if a CL-400 were to go into service, it would require a huge amount of liquid hydrogen, and eventually a series of 3 plants were built with increasing capacities by Apex, or Air Products Incorporated Experimental. This was opposite the Pratt & Whitney Test Center in Florida and called by the Suntan team as Baby Bear, Mama Bear and Papa Bear, with Papa Bear's capacity alone capable of producing 27,200 kilograms of liquid hydrogen per day. This would not be ready until 1959 and after Project Suntan had ended, but it did become a major supplier of hydrogen to the space program that followed. Testing of the engines by Pratt & Whitney also was progressing. There had been some failures, but nothing more than would have been expected with new and untested technology. By the time the project ended, they had run for 25.5 hours and development was proceeding satisfactorily. However, problems over the range were causing concern with the top brass in the Air Force, and the misconception about hydrogen as being a dangerous fuel didn't help, even though the Suntan team had proved that it was much less damaging in a fire compared to gasoline, and that hydrogen was difficult to explode unless it was mixed in equal parts with pure oxygen. Again, something which didn't really occur until the space program. When General Curtis LeMay, formerly of the Strategic Air Command, who had moved up to Vice Chief of Staff, received a briefing about the project, his reaction was along the lines of, "What? Put my pilots up there with a bomb?" Which was rather ironic as he had dozens of B-52s flying 24/7, all with multiple hydrogen bombs on board. But the demise of Project Suntan really came about when Kelly Jonhson changed his mind about the whole feasibility of the hydrogen-fueled aircraft after about 6 months of experimentation and study. The Air Force insisted that a minimum distance to the target should be 2,800 kilometers, though Jonhson thought 2,000 kilometers was the best that could be achieved. In the end, the funds which had been allocated to the project were diverted to other projects, and just like real Suntan, Project Suntan faded away without any real conclusion. The costs involved are, because of the top secret nature of the project, still unknown, though it's believed to have been between $100 and $250 million. Kelly Johnson's fear of a downed U-2 became real in 1960, but by 1957 Lockheed had been approached by the CIA to build a undetectable supersonic successor to the U-2, even if it couldn't fly above 100,000 feet of the CL-400. This was initially known as the A-10, which was developed into the A-12, and then of course the now iconic SR-71. But the work on production, handling, transportation and the power of hydrogen wasn't to be lost, and found its way into the space program of the 1960s, including Apollo, and the Space Shuttle and space projects right up until the present day. With online security being one of the most important aspects of the internet today, you need to make sure that you're protected not only from hackers and malicious software, but also keeping things safe with strong, secure passwords. And with NordVPN, you can combine all of these, which is why I choose it for my VPN and security requirements. Using a VPN hides your computer's real IP address whilst you're out surfing the net, and makes it much more difficult for hackers to gain access to your computer and to any potentially personal data like passwords, bank logins, etc. And now with NordVPN's new cybersecurity feature, which is built right into the app, you'll also be protected from websites that are known to host things like phishing, malware, trackers and alike by blocking them before they can infect your computer. If you go with a NordVPN 3-year plan, you'll not only save 81%, but you'll also get 4 extra months free and the new NordPass password manager to avoid the pain of keeping track of all those different passwords you need today, keeping them safe, generating new unique ones when needed, and auto-filling forms to save you having to look them up. You can get all of this by using the coupon code CuriousDroid at the address now shown, and there's even a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no excuse for not trying it out.